argue that independent journalism can play the role of bridging the two societies in a time of intense geopolitical competition, in a time when institutional journalism on both sides no longer plays that role.
Journalists like me, we have to do a lot of unpacking to bridge the gaps between different perspectives. From the American perspective, why do they see all these Chinese individuals and businesses as threats? From the Chinese perspectives, why they are still trying to enter American markets, what are their motivations? It's actually more human than people would have thought.
What is the role of journalism in China?
Recently in China, institutional journalism has been declined for a while. By institutional journalism, I mean journalism produced by large established media organizations. It's not like a newspaper go bankrupt, but censorship over what can be reported has become so pervasive that meaningful oversight over political power is almost impossible anymore. Although when talking about journalism in China, people almost immediately think about censorship. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a period when institutional journalism was given more space to report on social problems, abuse of power, and infringement of legal rights. Institutional journalism at that time constituted a venue through which the central government could know what's going on in the local, because China is such a big country. With its multi-layered bureaucratic system, the central government needs voices from the outside to know dysfunctions in the system and implementation of policies. And this gave institutional journalism some space to be critical or at least reflective of certain government policy and practices. This is not to say that institutional journalism was merely an extension of the Chinese government, or journalists at that time had full freedom over what they can and what they cannot report. There were still red lines, of course. However, there was at least an understanding that critical journalism should be tolerated. But that has changed in the recent decade. The list of what can't be reported expanded significantly, and critical journalism was no longer valued. And this led to a loss of talent, like experienced journalists leaving newspaper or news station to take up public relation jobs in the private companies. Those staying have to comply with more strict censorship standards and dancing shackles. This is what I mean by the decline of institutional journalism. Meanwhile, it doesn't mean the end of journalism in China. Today in China and in other countries, journalism no longer just means working for a newspaper or a news station. It takes on more diverse forms. Individual journalists can post videos on YouTube, can make podcasts, and can collaborate with news institutions. Many famous Chinese journalists like Chai Jing and Cui Yongyuan left the institution to have their own YouTube channel. We also have small content producing companies like Shen FM, 生动活泼. It's not a traditional news agency, but it was founded by a former journalist, and it focuses on covering the tech industry. It has produced some in-depth investigative journalist reporting on social issues such as drug use in the bodybuilding industry, addiction to online games among Chinese teenagers. Can these diverse forms of the journalist reporting replace institutional journalism? No, but journalism in China is not going away. These talents, these people, they're still there, just working to adapt to the current environment and produce content as they can. So in short, Chinese journalism is not monolithic. It takes on different forms and has different shades. It always faces some forms of censorship and political scrutiny, but that cannot kill journalism in China.
What is the role of journalism in the U.S China relationship?
For institutional journalism, when it comes to U.S China relations, it largely serves as the mouthpiece of the Chinese government. There are several reasons for that. First and foremost, the red line is pretty clear here. U.S China relation is central to the Chinese government's foreign policy, which is an area that the government has broad public support. Also, even in the U.S., established news media is less likely to challenge the government's foreign policy as compared to domestic ones, because reporting on foreign policy relies on official sources anywhere. And when something is framed as a national security issue, it is more or less protected from public scrutiny. And not to mention that many journalists internalize the patriotism and nationalist sentiment in China, in the US, and in other parts of the world. So it's not surprising that institutional journalism in China mainly just echoes the government's narratives regarding U.S. China relations. However, independent journalism can be different. Firstly, most of them don't have access to official sources anyway. That's the cost of living established news media. So they have to take a different strategy and report based on interviewing ordinary people, entrepreneurs whose business is affected by the trade war, people who illegally immigrate from China to the US. So many of these independent journalists have experienced living abroad or they currently live abroad. So they have more connections outside China. These connections can give them more diverse perspective in their reporting. They are more likely to report on the cost of the trade war on the Chinese side, such as the uncertainty that Chinese export companies have to digest when squeezed by Trump's tariff on one side and China's nationalist sentiment on the other. Therefore, I would argue that independent journalism can play the role of bridging the two societies in a time of intense geopolitical competition, in a time when institutional journalism on both sides no longer plays that role.
As U.S. China relations have changed, how has the role of journalists changed?
When I first started my career, I found myself doing a lot of stories explaining the weird stuff happening in China. The weird not in a negative way, but it's just like a lot of like novelty. Why do Chinese people do this and that? Why people don't use cash anymore in China? I feel like I'm explaining this kind of different innovations that are happening in China. But in recent years, I feel we are doing a lot of work unpacking conflicts. So, for example, the story of TikTok. Recently, I did a story about a Chinese battery company that is building factories in America's Midwest. And then that triggered a big political backlash. So a big part of my job as kind of someone who is covering U.S.-China relations is to explain conflicts. So we need to explain like why there are these kind of tensions, but we also need to show the human perspectives. From the American perspective, why do they see all these Chinese individuals and businesses as threats? But also from the Chinese perspectives, why they are still trying to enter American markets, what are their motivations. A lot of times the motivations are not that political. So I feel like journalists like me, we have to do a lot of like unpacking to bridge the gaps between different perspectives and to clean up a lot of misunderstanding. When I'm covering tech in recent years, especially when it comes to, for example, the AI industry, a lot of like what Chinese businesses and individuals are doing are like very easily put into this broader U.S.-China tech war framing. We see the rise of DeepSeek, and then over here the story is like, oh, China is catching up. China is beating the U.S. on something. It shows like China's like national strengths or something. But I felt over there, when I look at how the same stories are told in Chinese media, or when I talk to individual entrepreneurs, engineers, tech workers, for them it's more like we wanted to build a product that is one of the best in the world. We wanted to get closer to the peers in Silicon Valley. We wanted to share our work and show we are doing innovative work, just like the peers in America. And it's actually more cooperative than people have assumed. The American public always see China as a single entity, that the government is trying to compete with America and that all the people are trying to compete with America. But sometimes why Chinese people or Chinese companies do something is just like the same as why American companies are doing something. They wanted to make money. They wanted to build a brand. They wanted to be known as the best in the world. It's actually more human than people would have thought.
What difficulties have you recently encountered when trying to cover the U.S.-China relationship?
I think this U.S.-China tensions also has made Chinese people less willing to speak to international media, which I think has made actually the job for like China-focused journalists more difficult because they feel uncomfortable with how their voices are often presented in America. And then I think people, a lot of time they worry about their stories, their personal experience being put into this like broader U.S. China conflict context. So it's really hard to get interviews with Chinese people these days. I think that also makes the job more challenging, but also more important. In recent years, the media environment in China has also changed a lot. I think because the state is also stepping up control over the media environment in China. So I think the media coverage in China in general has become less critical of authorities. So I think people are used to that kind of environments. And then when they see their quotes, their stories being put under a more critical lens here on American media, sometimes they don't understand that. Or why you are writing a negative story about us. But that's how American media work. Of course, journalists write negative stories. We write about bad things. Part of my job is to explain to people that even though the story is about maybe a big conflict, it's still good to have your experience presented in a very authentic, nuanced way there to explain where you come from